My name is Mary, and I'm getting close to my late 50s this year. I have 2 children. My elder son has become a working adult and is planning to get married to his girlfriend soon. My eldest daughter is currently a college student, and though she seems to be working hard every day, she appears to be thoroughly enjoying her university life. With my children growing up, I've almost finished my duties as a mother, and being a former nurse, I'm considering returning to the caregiving profession. One day, I got the shocking news that my father-in-law, Bob, had suffered a stroke. I received a call from my husband, John, and rushed to the hospital where Bob was admitted. Bob has always been a very earnest man, gentle, and has been very kind to me, his daughter-in-law. However, I have been worried because he hasn't been in good spirits since his wife, Alice, passed away 3 years ago. I occasionally visited his house to check on him and noticed a clear lack of energy, so we had been frequently inviting him out with the kids. Amidst this, when I had just begun to notice a return of vitality to Bob, the news of his stroke filled me with unease. When I arrived at the hospital, Bob's daughter and her husband were there, engaged in some conversation. "Sorry I'm late. How's Bob doing?" I asked, catching my breath as I approached John's sister, Isabella. Isabella sighed in irritation when she noticed me and said, "You're late. We have somewhere to be, so can you take it from here?" With that, she left briskly. Isabella has always seemed indifferent to Bob, often treating him coldly. Not only Bob, but she was the same with Alice when she was alive. Bob and Alice were such kind people, and they never said anything to her. But I think that's what made her what she is now. For now, I paced around the waiting area nervously while Bob was presumably in surgery. In the meantime, John arrived at the hospital.
"Mary, how's Dad?"
John was obviously worried. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his dress shirt was soaked with perspiration. When I shook my head, John dropped the bags he was carrying, his face pale.
No way."
I quickly corrected him. "No, he's still in surgery. We don't know yet." John seemed to relax a bit, picking up his fallen bags and sinking into a chair.
"Should we prepare ourselves?"
I rushed over to John, who looked on the verge of tears, and put my hand on his back. "No, it's going to be okay." I felt helpless, not being able to say anything else, but I couldn't think of anything else to say. A few hours later, the surgery ended, and we were told by the doctor to come into a small room for an explanation.
"The surgery was successful. However, he will most likely have some lasting effects."
In other words, we were told Bob would need care. While I do hope for Bob's wellness, if it comes to providing care, this also involves Isabella and her husband. John and I decided to call Isabella to discuss this. As a result, we agreed to talk things out and arranged a meeting at Bob's house while he was still in the hospital. "I'm not going to look after him," Isabella announced as soon as the discussion started, shocking John and me.
"Wait, if you're not going to, what are we supposed to do?"
"I don't care. You two can take care of him," my sister-in-law Isabella said, idly fiddling with her neatly decorated nails that were done somewhere. Her husband, Tom, nodded in agreement. "What about a nursing home?" "What on earth are you talking about? I don't intend to waste money." This is what happens whenever I step in. Isabella glares at me with a look of the devil on her face. It feels like I'm not allowed to voice an opinion, so I shut my mouth.
"If he can't go to a facility, and you girls won't look after him, then what are we going to do?"
"That's why you guys should take care of him. I don't need some decrepit poverty god in my house." Isabella giggles as she speaks. Even I, normally patient, lost my cool at that. "That's too much, even for you. He's your father." "I don't care. Why is it that just because he's my father, I have to be the one to look after him? Besides, he's John's father too. I've been saying you guys should look after him." There's nothing I can say to that. If we could take care of him at home, I would love to. But our house isn't fully accessible. There are many steps and level differences. If we were to take in my father-in-law, we'd have to remodel our house, and we don't have enough funds for that. "Mary, don't you have a care worker certification? Taking care of Dad should be easy, right?" I was at a loss for words at Isabella's smug face. John, too, seemed to feel the same. and we decided to take the issue home for the time being, leaving our in-laws' house behind.
What should we do? Mary, you were thinking about going back to your care work.
That's okay. I wasn't absolutely set on going back, so don't worry about it, I gently said to a troubled John. The issue is the money. I don't mind taking in your father, but if we do, we'll need to make this house accessible so he won't fall, and medical equipment isn't cheap.
You're right.
I wonder if it'll cost about $100,000. That's just a rough estimate, but if we think about adjusting the entire first floor for him to live on, that's about how much it'd cost. Our eldest daughter is still in college, so we don't have that much money. We still have a mortgage on the house, and the thought of adding a loan for renovations is daunting.
I feel terrible about this, but should we ask him to go to a facility?
The question is, can we even get him in one? The waiting lists are long, and the costs aren't negligible. I'm sure Isabella and her family won't help. There seems to be no solution in sight. We decided to at least hear out my father-in-law's opinion, and I alone went to the hospital where he was hospitalized. Upon entering his room, I found my father-in-law had recovered considerably and greeted me with a smile.
Sorry for all the trouble.
Every time I visited, my father-in-law would say something like this. Why would you say that? Now, I've brought you one of your favorite books today. According to the doctor, my father-in-law suffered a stroke on one side of his body and could no longer move the right half of his body on his own. Because of this, when reading a book, he would place it on the table and use something heavy to keep the pages from turning on their own. Ah, thank you. My father-in-law took the book I had brought and placed it by his pillow. Dad, I came today because I wanted to talk about something. It's about what's to come. At this, my father-in-law smiled warmly.
Oh, I know. I'll be okay, even in a nursing home. I have saved up for it, so you don't have to worry.
Despite his words, I could see a hint of loneliness in his expression. Well, Dad, if you're okay with it, why not come to our house? I've worked in elderly care before, and I'm a stay-at-home mom, so I have time. And John's there too. That's right. Let's live together. I blurted out the words, seeing his lonely expression. My father-in-law looked at me in surprise.
That's a kind offer.
He must have felt it somewhere within him, that he couldn't go back to his own house anymore. His own house, where his daughter Isabella and her husband are living. And I can see them treating him as an inconvenience if he were to return, ultimately leading him to a nursing home. Thinking this, I felt a pang of sadness. I had initially planned to listen to my father-in-law's feelings and proceed with the conversation accordingly, but I got ahead of myself. I felt somewhat guilty towards my husband, John, but I knew he would understand. Now, all that was left was to somehow arrange for his aftercare before his discharge. The problem was the cost. I decided to consult Isabella once. With these thoughts, I headed home. When John came back from work and I told him what had happened at the hospital, he looked a bit troubled, but agreed as if he had known it would come to this. John called Isabella right there.
That's why we're asking for your help, because we're the ones who are going to be looking after Dad.
It seemed like John and Isabella were arguing over the phone, and John's tone was getting a little harsh. With a sigh, he hung up the phone. John explained his conversation with Isabella. It seemed she was refusing to give any money, and there was nothing we could do about it. For the sake of my father-in-law, John began to discuss how we could handle the costs. After that, our house got a bit noisy. We discussed how to renovate the house and what kind of care supplies we'd need, and received various explanations about home care. When I told my father-in-law that he would be living with us after he was discharged, he looked apologetic, but also pleased.
Mary, could you get the checkbook that's over there?
My recovered father-in-law pointed at a cloth bag on the shelf during one of our visits. Wondering what he'd use a checkbook for, I did as he asked and took it out. Watching my father-in-law, I saw him open the bank book and show it to me. I have some money here. Can you and John use it? The checkbook he showed me had an amount written in it that I had never seen before. When I froze seeing this, my father-in-law laughed and said, "You and John will be taking care of me from now on, right? I heard about you getting a new car and making the house accessible. Would $10 million be enough for that?" $10 million? I hadn't counted the zeros, but I was shocked at the number of $10 million. I had no idea why my father-in-law had saved so much money, But apparently after my mother-in-law passed away, he didn't feel like doing anything and decided to venture into the investments he had been studying for a while. It seems to have worked out better than expected, and his savings began to accumulate quickly. He was not a big spender, so he only kept on saving. However, even if he wanted to remodel the house or buy a new car, it shouldn't cost that much. I handed his bank book back to him and said, I can't accept this much. Please use this for yourself. He, in turn, offered the bank book back to me, saying, I can't use all this money. I would rather give it back to you and your family, who are willing to take care of me. Stuck with the predicament of the returned bank book again, I refused. Still, I can't accept so much. My father-in-law, after contemplating for a while with a troubled look, proposed, What about $1 million? Seeing no end to this, I managed to persuade him to agree to a reduced sum of $100,000. He still seemed dissatisfied, but for the moment that was good. As such an exchange was going on, I'm here! Isabella appeared out of nowhere. With the entrance of Isabella, who was oblivious to money matters, I hurriedly shoved my father-in-law's bank book back into its original place. Seeing this, my sister-in-law Isabella frowned and asked, What's going on? With a hint of worry in her voice. I was relieved that she hadn't heard our previous conversation. Isabella had come to bring some clothes for our father. After chatting for a bit, we both left the hospital room, but on our way home, Isabella suddenly said that she had something to discuss and suggested we stop by a coffee shop. Her talks have never been about anything good in the past, so I assumed this wouldn't be any different. I reluctantly agreed, but it turned out to be a mistake. I will take care of Dad. What? At the sudden proposal, I was taken aback. Despite her words, we're already in the middle of preparations to accommodate my father-in-law, even starting renovations on the house. I couldn't help but wonder why she would suddenly propose such a thing. So, you don't have to visit the hospital from tomorrow. No, visiting has nothing to do with it. There's no rule stating that only the caretaker should visit, so why would she say such a thing? Although I had doubts about Isabella's statement, I suggested we discuss it at another time and left the cafe. When I told my husband John about this at home, he pondered over it and suddenly seemed to connect the dots.
She must have overheard about the savings.
Although I had a hunch about it, it seems that was the case, John said.
Otherwise, there's no way she would accept the caretaking, especially considering she was so opposed to it until recently.
I had vaguely suspected that she had found out about the money and was trying to curry favor to inherit all of it. She might even come up with some excuse to start spending it. But what should we do? I asked.
I have an idea. Let's let her take a shot,
said John, with a sly grin on his face, indicating he was up to something. Feeling uneasy about his plan, I decided to keep quiet and follow Isabella's request for now. I had conveyed to my father-in-law that he wouldn't need to worry about money and that his daughter Isabella would be providing care. His response was ambiguous, a vague expression not quite affirming or denying his understanding, and with that, the conversation ended. Afterward, he was safely discharged from the hospital and returned to his family home in Nebraska where Isabella resided. When my father-in-law was discharged, I had the chance to inspect the family home. The state of the house was unclear. There was no renovation, and it was questionable whether there were enough caregiving supplies. I doubted if real caregiving could happen in such conditions. However, this was Isabella's choice. I felt it was not my place to comment, so I decided to keep quiet. 2 months later, I got a call from Isabella. Mary, I can't do this anymore. Please come over right now. She sounded frantic over the phone, so I responded and hurried over to the house in Nebraska. When I arrived, the house was messy and there was a disgusting odor in the air. As I was wondering what happened, Isabella appeared, looking more disheveled than ever. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her walk was unsteady. Are you okay? I rushed over to Isabella, clearly in a bad state. Isabella grabbed my hand and said, Take Dad away. At first, I didn't understand what she meant, but after calming her down and getting her to explain, it seemed she had underestimated the challenges of caregiving. The duties extended from assistance with walking and meals to dealing with incontinence, which also meant dealing with diapers. It was overwhelming for her, not being able to handle anything around the house or even look at herself. I told her I couldn't make any decisions right then and promised to contact her as soon as possible. I took this matter home with me.
It lasted 2 months. That's impressive.
My husband John muttered as he glanced at the calendar. Apparently he had seen this coming. He proposed we go and pick up my father-in-law on his next day off, and I agreed. A few days later, when we arrived at the family home in Nebraska, my father-in-law was already packed and ready to leave. I felt relieved that I could finally take him home. I've endured for 2 months, and I used to live here too, so I deserve at least $5 million, Isabella said out of the blue as we were about to help my father-in-law into the car. I was so startled that I stopped in my tracks. John, too, was taken aback and turned to look at Isabella. Unfazed, she had a smug expression on her face.
What are you talking about, Isabella? This is not the time or place to talk about money, especially in front of Dad. He raised us, after all.
John tried to reason with her, but it seemed to have no effect. I'm his daughter. It's only fair that I get paid. Her defiant response surprised me. How could she be so brazen? I questioned Isabella's personality.
Enough, Isabella. You shouldn't be talking about such unsavory matters. And besides, you've already received money, my father-in-law injected with a disbelieving expression.
There's none left. Just $5 million. What's so hard about that? If you're just going to wither away, you might as well put it to good use.
Sis!
I was taken aback. To think she would dare to speak in such a manner to her own father. I stood frozen in surprise. Even my usually composed husband, John, seemed to be seething at Isabella's words, his face turning beet red as he glared at her.
John, it's okay. She's speaking the truth.
In an attempt to soothe his riled-up son, Bob, my father-in-law, gently reassured him and then turned to Isabella with a stern expression.
Isabella, you are no longer my child. Leave this house.
His words were icy, to the point. Upon hearing this, Isabella froze in shock. What? What are you talking about? I'm your only daughter.
I only have a son, and this kind and caring woman here is my daughter-in-law. I don't know you anymore. Take your foolish husband and leave.
Having only heard the soft-spoken side of my father-in-law, Bob, I was astonished at the harsh tone now. Looking at Bob, his eyes were hardened, not permitting any defiance. It seemed as though that the message was being conveyed. Even Isabella was silenced by his dominance.
Well then, shall we go? We're counting on you moving forward.
It was as if the face from earlier had disappeared. Bob was back to his usual self, and he smiled at me. John and I had no choice but to follow his words. We drove back home, leaving a stunned Isabella standing in place. Apparently, Bob later arranged through his lawyer for a last will and testament, stating that the inheritance would go only to John, and ensuring that no portion of it would end up with Isabella. Though the house became vacant with Isabella's departure, John and I wanted to live there, and Bob was happy to oblige. Isabella and her husband moved out and into an apartment, and it seemed that they had been using a significant amount of Bob's money even when he was in good health. Their spendthrift habits led them into debt, and now they're struggling to pay it back. Every day I can't help but think that this is the inevitable outcome for someone like Isabella, who can't respect or repay her parent even if he's her biological father. While caring for Bob is indeed tough, as a person who has been in the caregiving profession, it doesn't feel like a burden to me, and we're able to maintain a good relationship.